Welcome to Anthropology 340. It is Wednesday of week 4. We are going to begin our geographic tour of Native Americans of North America by starting in the prehistoric Southwest. We're doing pretty good. We're in week 4. We're only, I think, a day behind of where we should be. So we are pretty much on track. So we're going to from here on out, for the most part, it's going to be set up geographically. We're going to be moving through the Sutton chapters. We're going to do not necessarily in the same order he does. I've changed the order around for practical and personal reasons, just because I like certain things better, and I think the flow kind of works a little better this way. But you're welcome to read them in any order you'd like. But for this class, we're going to go in this order. I don't know why that screen's not working. Um, hmm. Sorry, everybody on that side of the room. You might want to move over. So we're going to do Southwest today, and most weeks from here on out, we're going to kind of break it up into 3 parts. The really old prehistoric stuff on the first day, second day kind of being the colonial era. Oftentimes it's either with Spanish or British or American colonization. And we'll talk about how that impacted people. And then finally, on the third day, usually kind of doing some more modern stuff. Some days we'll have to kind of compress 2 of those into, 3 of those lessons into 2 days, just to kind of fit with the schedule. That's generally what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to do this week. We're going to start with the ancient Southwest today. This week you have a discussion board. You also have a quiz, and you have your first culture area worksheet. If you haven't taken a look at that, you can find that on the Canvas module. It's right here. 126. Make sure that I'm going to share the screen for those of you online so you can see it. Make sure when you do this, we're going to be doing this worksheet quite a number of times throughout the course of the semester. I think it's like 7 of your 10 homeworks or so. Follow the same format, and you're going to write 350 to 500 words. You want to make sure you hit all these categories. This is useful because it helps you think about the different parts of culture, but also it's going to help you for your presentation and paper in this class because it's set up the same way. So the idea is that you start doing this for homework, and then when you get to your paper and presentation, it's not a big deal because you've been doing it all along throughout the whole semester. Make sure when you do this, do you're going to write the culture area here. It's going to be focused on the Southwest this week. And don't do one particular group. Don't put Hopi or Navajo or something like that. You want to talk about the culture area in general, because as you're going to see for the Southwest this week, there is a pretty big difference between the Dene speaking hunter and gatherer and later pastoral people like the Navajo and Apache, and the Hopi and other Puebloan groups who have a much more sedentary agricultural based way of life. So you want to talk about both. You want to talk about the diversity of peoples in that culture region. And then you're going to write a little summary of your findings down at the bottom. So make sure you hit all those parts. It's super easy for me to grade because I can just kind of see if you've done all the different pieces and parts. Why it's set up that way. Any questions about that? Good. Okay, so we're going to jump into the Southwest today. I got 2 short films. If you're following along at home, we're going to be watching this video number 1, the Anasazi, as well as video number 4, Hohokam Canals, a little bit of each of those to go along with our discussion today. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Southwest, especially the ancient Southwest. And one second, let me full screen that. There we go. Yeah, that's right. Okay, and I think that I actually started with it because how many of you went to school, like high school or middle school in New Mexico, Arizona, somewhere? You have a familiar background, right? And you probably got some of this in like history class, right? Little bit about Chaco Canyon, maybe, or the different ruins, or if you're from Arizona, maybe the Hohokam canals and things. So for some people, at least people who are from the region, this might be more familiar. For those of us like myself who are from outside, it's also one of the things that if you don't know anything about the Southwest, you might know a little bit about kind of the ancient Southwest, right? Like maybe you've seen Chaco Canyon videos, or you've seen something about the stellar alignments they have there, or maybe you've been to Mesa Verde. Or you've seen some of these things, or you've gone on vacation up there, right? So it's a popular point of reference for actual Native American ancient history in a way that maybe Cahokia, or maybe some of the things further east maybe are not, because it is kind of often during kind of the American colonial period, late 1800s. Uh, this was often seen as kind of, America's Egypt is what it was called, right? These are the ruins that, define the American continent and, show this continuity in the past. So there is this kind of popular idea, whether it's through the national parks or maybe you've seen a documentary film on or YouTube shorts or something like that. So hopefully we have some kind of basis for thinking about the Southwest. So in general, it's a pretty big region, right? We are actually kind of not in the Southwest here in eastern New Mexico. We're technically on the high plains. Usually the Pecos River over here is kind of how I divide the high plains from the Southwest. When you first go into Fort Sumner, you see that first butte or that mesa, and you're like, yeah, we've made it, right? We're in the Southwest. But we're right here, and if a lot of us go to Albuquerque or Santa Fe or Taos or somewhere else further west, and you probably, you're familiar at least with the geographic region about what we're talking about. But it is a very diverse region, right? Before I moved here, I was expecting like the classic kind of Sonoran desert Southwest, and we do have pieces of this. This is kind of like southern Arizona into kind of northern Mexico, with kind of cactuses and deserts. But that's not all we have, right? We have kind of the forested areas down here, kind of south of Albuquerque area, where the Mogollon lived, and then kind of this Colorado plateau where we see Anasazi people or ancestral Puebloan people live. So an ecologically diverse region, which has cultural diversity kind of mapped onto these different environments, which makes sense, especially if you're from Sutton's point of view, that the environment is really important to how you have your society, your civilization. So just look at this real quick. When we think of kind of northern New Mexico into kind of southern Colorado, northwest or northeast Arizona, maybe a little bit of Utah up there. This is kind of what we're thinking of, right? This is the Colorado Plateau, kind of buttressed by on either side of the Colorado River and its tributaries, pretty much the Four Corners region of the Southwest. It's got canyons, rocky landscapes, mesas, and buttes. It's also got forested region. Gets snowfall in the winter, which makes it a little bit greener, especially in some parts than other parts of the Southwest. Kind of southwestern New Mexico and south central or south Arizona, you have the Mogollon Rim. This is a forested uplands. It's a little bit it's a little bit greener than what we would see in the next part, which is right here and into the Sonoran Desert, right? This is kind of what we think of if you're an outsider to the Southwest as kind of classic Southwest, right? Cowboys and native people going around in the desert with cactus and rattlesnakes and things like that, right? But each of these ecological regions is really important because the ecological circumstances kind of help determine or at least kind of constrain or shape what kind of ways of life go on here. And another thing that's interesting is that when you look at this map, you'll notice my circles aren't exact, right? But these circles are not constrained to political boundaries, whether that be states or national, right? There's a lot of overlap. And even today, like the Tohono O'odham, their reservation is literally kind of spans the US-Mexico border, and they have to have their own special entrance to go back and forth for harvesting resources or for going to rituals. You'll also see this up here. Kind of on the New Mexico Mexico border. There's a lot of continuity between this, like something like Casas Grande down here in Mexico has a lot of continuity with the places up here in the Southwest, and even something like Chaco Canyon all the way up here has these cultural and economic ties down with central Mexico, trading chocolate and macaw feathers. For turquoise and things like that. So we have this idea oftentimes, I think, in pop society that when we think about the Southwest and the ancient Southwest, right, it's confined to the American Southwest. But these borders are pretty, they're political and they're artificial, and they're not even that old, right? The Mexican-American War, and before that, kind of the Spanish, right? Set these boundaries up not entirely too long ago, right? So when we're talking about the ancient Southwest, just forget all these dotted lines on the map and think about the natural features and how they constrain the region. We're going to do this in a slightly different order than I have in the PowerPoint. We're going to start up here on the plateau with the Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan. Then we're going to go down here to like the Phoenix, Tucson area of Arizona, and then down here southwest New Mexico. We'll start with the ancestral Puebloans, or as they're most commonly known, the Anasazi, which are, I would guess, probably one of the, if not the most famous of the prehistoric groups of native people in the Southwest. Anasazi is what you'll probably hear more in popular culture, especially for older media. But the term ancestral Puebloan is more popular these days because Anasazi is seen as a Navajo word, and these people are ancestral Puebloans. So the Pueblo people don't necessarily like the Navajo term given for their ancestors, right? So we try to use a more culturally at least nuanced term. But realizing that this term Anasazi is still very much in popular kind of circulation in our society. Um, and when we talk about ancestral Puebloan or Anasazi society, um, we often think of them as agriculturalists, and this is kind of one of the defining characteristics of Puebloan society. This is focused on what was called the Three Sisters crop. What is that? What are the Three Sisters? Yep, corns, beans, and squash, right? And they go together. They both they grow well together physically, right? A corn stalk grows and beans can kind of go up like a trellis, and the squash spreads out and provides shade in microclimates. But they also work together nitrogen to fix like nitrogen in the soil from the beans because the corn is using this up. So you plant these things together, and it provides a good crop. But corn and agriculture in general came relatively late to the Southwest. Right, it starts in Mexico, and before that, people are doing hunting and gathering. But by about 200 BC, we start to see a change. About 2,400, 2,200 years ago, as people start to do agriculture, it gets kind of passed up from Mesoamerica, and people start to settle into these permanent structures. And permanent structures is kind of the hallmark of this part of the Southwest, right? This idea that people are living in one place and they are growing food. And we can see this archaeologically, especially in the design of the houses, right? That we switch from these mobile camps to more sedentary houses, often with granary areas or pit houses there. These are pretty scattered early on, but by about 800 AD, we start to see the switch from previously we had these like semi-subterranean pit houses. See how it's like you dig down halfway, it's not completely underground, like halfway down on the building. Um, but then after 800, we get these above ground pueblos, and pueblos become kind of the architectural feature of the Southwest. But these underground or semi-subterranean pit houses get retained in a new form as the kiva, which is you might have seen these kind of in contrast to the kind of square or rectangular buildings which characterize Pueblo architecture or the Pueblo where you live. The kiva is a round building and it's partially or mostly underground, and it's used for ritual or ceremonial context. So you have this kind of palimpsest or this layering of architectural forms as you get further along in history. Um, and this gets pretty big, right? So we start out with kind of simple one or two room structures with maybe a pit or a granary associated with it. Then we get a little bit bigger, 4, 6, 10 rooms. But by the time we get to Chaco Canyon, about 1000 AD or so, we get these large congregations of rooms with both kind of these square rooms, which are used for living and storage. You can see a whole bunch of them over here, as well as these round rooms, which are these kivas used for rituals and ceremonial purposes. So just looking at this architectural map, this is the 2D version. It's going to be much taller, up to 5 stories tall when you look at it 3D. What can we see about Pueblo Bonito? A lot of rooms. What else do we notice about, especially the ratio of room types?
Plots, kivas that are kind of situated around plazas.
Yeah. And a whole lot of kivas, right? Especially compared to the ratio of square to round is pretty high, right? Like it's, what do you think that means? Why do they have so much ritual architecture here? That would be like a church for every, I don't know, 5 or 6 little squares.
That they just find religion and their kind of their architecture for religion, their religion.
Yeah, this is some kind of architectural center, not necessarily maybe it is for living and for storing, but it has a ritual purpose. And probably, and archaeologically we can see this, that there people are coming from elsewhere, right? You can't fill up, it's like having a big mega church in your tiny town. You're like, what are we going to fill up this place with? But it's because people are coming from elsewhere. And Chaco becomes the center of a large um, regional or macro regional political slash social organization, which comes to define kind of this early or the kind of prehistoric era in the Southwest. So I'm going to stop it here, and if you're following along at home, you can switch over to our first video on the Anasazi 500 Nations of North America. So I'm going to pause it here so we don't get copyrighted, and we'll rejoin in a moment. We just watched video number 1 on the ancestral Puebloans or Anasazi people. And we're talking about that for just a moment or two before we jump into the next group. So we talked about, we saw in the video, Pueblo Bonito, which is kind of often gets, people think of that as kind of synonymous with Chaco Canyon, but it's actually just one piece of this larger regional puzzle or this regional map. And if you have taken my Southwest class, or if you're interested, we talk about the roads, and you have large roads emanating out from Pueblo Bonito going in all directions, connecting it to these different pueblos in the canyon as well as parts beyond. And they're really interesting, massive roads, and you can actually still see them today. Roads. Here's a map. Oh, come on. Show the map. It's a terrible map. But you can see that these go kind of emanate outwards from Chaco Canyon, going for 100 miles or more. And they're pretty wide roads, which is also very interesting. That's a much better map. But so you got Chaco Canyon here, and you got kind of these dots being Pueblo and Great Houses, and you can kind of see how they are connected within this kind of beyond a single site into a larger regional system. And they're pretty big roads. Find a good picture. That's not one. There you go. You get these big roads going, and it's really interesting because they don't have draft animals or carts or anything, but they're fairly large, wide roads, and archaeologists think they're used maybe for pilgrimage, especially, or as a kind of social signaling, showing people this is all part of one major network. Another interesting thing about that we see with Chaco Canyon and especially with Pueblo Bonito is that it's a pretty large area, and it's pretty complex, right? And it shows signs of having these social complexities like we would see in, classic ancient civilization. Like if you take my origins class, we'll talk about that. But one thing that is different than maybe say, ancient Egypt or ancient Maya civilizations or these other kind of major civilizations that we talk about is there doesn't seem to be a ton of hierarchy going on here. There doesn't seem to be a king or a chief ruling over this. There may be the beginnings of kind of a scribe status, because we do find children buried there that seem to have some kind of grave goods or some kind of special status. You can tell because they have shells or beads or something with them. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of elites who are ruling like a chief or like a king. And this continues on through kind of the later periods as well, up to the modern Puebloan people, which seem to be much more egalitarian than a lot of these other groups. So it poses one of these interesting questions in archaeology, like how do you create this and maintain complexity when you don't seem to have a king or an emperor or a chief telling everyone what to do? Another interesting thing, which you can kind of see on this map from this arrow, is that it was built in phases. You can actually see architecturally, right? Like it's very similar to like if you ever look at a map of Portales streets. You notice how they all go one way and then they shift. It's because they made the town one way and then they kind of moved it. And you can actually see that up here, right? There was this kind of earlier section that you can see, and then you can see how some of these rooms are little tiny triangles because they had to, you know, expand it and they had to use the original architecture versus kind of tearing it down and rebuilding it whole cloth. While this was a major center, and I actually kind of got into Chaco Canyon from the Mesoamerica angle, working with chocolate. We can find evidence of chocolate being traded all the way up to Chaco Canyon in the prehistoric era. And you find chocolate pots and the residue of chocolate, which is really interesting because you don't grow chocolate here in New Mexico. You need 100 inches of rain or more a year and no frost at all to grow a cacao tree, and that's not the conditions here. So it's a great kind of indicator of these large scale regional trades as well. Going, cacao and macaws, especially going one way, and then like you saw in the video, turquoise going the other. Um, and sorry, I wish I had my roads still. Chaco roads. Back. And so a lot of these outlying settlements, these dots over here, are near turquoise producing areas, or we're in contact with turquoise producing areas, and it kind of gets funneled down. The raw turquoise gets funneled down to kind of these major centers here, and where it gets processed from kind of rough stone or large pieces to either disc or tiles, things that are relatively the same size, not quite currency, but they are kind of standardized a little bit, which allows for trading with these kind of central Mexican trading partners. Um, Yeah, and one other really interesting thing that you often see about Chaco Canyon is kind of the astronomical alignments and how, on a certain day you can look through this window at Chaco Canyon and other Puebloan sites, and on the solstice or on the equinox, and you'll see the sun hit a certain spot where there's a carving, right? And so they function almost like Stonehenge. That's probably the example we're most familiar with, but also Maya sites, Cahokia sites. A lot of these ancient sites are functioned like this, right? They become this kind of embodied calendar. And we have archaeologically, we have a lot of great artifacts from Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan sites. Often this cool black and white pottery, which is kind of the trademark. We also find kind of this turquoise materials as well. But despite its, grandeur, Chaco Canyon doesn't last. It has a very kind of short window in this fluorescence. And between 1150 and about 1175, maybe 1200, we see Chaco Canyon largely abandoned. And by the time Navajo people kind of roll into the region a couple hundred years later, these are ruins in the sense that like you might go see ruins today, right? They were seen as places inhabited by ghosts or something like that, right? Kind of spooky, out of the way places. But the Anasazi people did not vanish. They did not disappear. They moved, and they often moved to places like it was Mesa Verde in Colorado or Cannon de Chelly in Arizona. These kind of protected places during this time. Um, we see much more nucleation around these fortified or often cliff sites, and letting archaeologists know that probably there's some kind of conflict or warfare going on. We often see like burned buildings and things like that as well. And probably this is due to kind of large scale drought in the region. When we talk about HOCOM, we'll see some similar kind of pattern of cultural fluorescence and then kind of abandonment right around the same time. So there's the idea that the climate is shifting during this time, which makes agriculture a little harder, and it makes people a little more angry at their neighbors, or a little more frustrated and willing to use conflict and violence. So you get these fortified areas up there, kind of in the middle to late prehistoric era, and then eventually, as a lot of these cliff places are abandoned, people moving to what we think of today as like the Pueblo area, especially on kind of that upper, the Albuquerque to Taos section of the Rio Grande, as well as kind of the Hopi area over in Arizona. So these kind of traditional areas we see today. But we do see a couple Anasazi sites kind of hang on towards the end and then kind of get converted into these Pueblo areas, which is what the Spanish find when they show up into the Southwest in the 1500s. And we'll talk more about that next time, but we are doing okay. Next area we're gonna talk about is we've talked about this kind of Colorado Plateau up here. We're gonna move down here to kind of the Sonoran area, which is what you think of, the Salt River or the Gila River down here, Phoenix and Tucson area in Arizona today. And these people are this group or this area is known as the Hohokam. There we go. Yeah, Hohokam. So these are again kind of coming out of that same early agricultural tradition that the Anasazi have, right? So hunter and gatherers living there, corn gets traded up from Mexico. We see really early, kind of adoption of agriculture, and mostly in small, kind of scattered communities or small households doing agriculture. But by about 250, 300 AD, we start to see kind of larger settlements, especially around Tucson and Phoenix, which we start to see villages and then eventually cities. And in a lot of ways, this is very, especially as someone who has done archaeology in Mesoamerica, this seems very Mesoamerica to me. Again, this is why I think the boundary between the Southwest and Mexico is kind of artificial and silly, because we see a lot of these things that you would think of, right? When you think of Mexico, like mounds and especially ball courts. It's like very Maya-esque or Aztec, where you have the kind of sacred ball game that people will be playing. And it's has this very familiar Mesoamerican pattern or social pattern when you excavate or you do archaeology, right? You have a house cluster, and they're usually clustered around some kind of courtyard facing inward, right? They're very Mesoamerican, and then kind of a ball court, and maybe some pyramids or some mounds around within the important parts of the city. But the thing that the Hohokam are probably most well known for is their use of water, right, and irrigation canals. This is especially interesting because we think of like ancient Egypt with like their canals, or ancient China with the kind of rise of Chinese civilization tied to the control of water. And kind of early archaeological theory. The control of water is often tied to kind of political expansion and the emergence of civilization. So along the Salt and Gila rivers, you start to see, early on, people starting to expand where they can do agriculture. So you're doing agriculture in the desert. It's really not conducive to doing a lot of farming, except for in these areas right along the river, right? And that's fine when you have a fairly small population. You can all kind of live across next to the river. But what do you do when you have more and more people? You make more and more rivers, right? You dig canals outward, and you expand the area in which you can do that. But what's kind of the problem with irrigation, especially like, yeah, it's a commodity. It's hard to do. It's not something that I can decide to do myself, right? Like, I want a canal. Well, that's cool and all, but like, it's not something you can do. You have to have people working together. So again, we see the emergence of social complexity, especially in terms of like managing these resources and getting people to work together, because you have to, once you build it, get everybody to build it, and you have to keep it clean, right? If you've ever been to like northern New Mexico, even today, the acequias up there need to be cleaned every year, and you have to have some kind of organization. You have to have a group and some kind of leadership to like get people together and clean these things, and not to take everybody's water, right? So I'm the guy upstream. I'm going to divert all the water to my farm, so the people downstream don't have any. So how do you manage this, right? Especially in a society that doesn't seem to have kings and queens and emperors and things like that. So this is kind of one of those big questions in Southwest archaeology. Like, how do you manage these complex systems in a place that doesn't seem to have what we think of as traditional political structure. So our second video or last video for today is going to be on the Hohokam canals. We're going to watch a piece of this. It's in English and in Spanish. We'll just watch the one piece. And if you want, you can watch the other one. Yeah, and kind of talk about the complex canals which the Hohokam people are known for. Turn that off. How do I do this? I don't think I was sharing. Too bad. Sorry. All right, so we are back from watching our video on the Hohokam and their irrigation system. Again, I think it's just interesting how a lot of these Southwest groups are interesting in the archaeological kind of discussion for showing these counter examples to maybe old world civilizations, right? What's a civilization look like when you don't have draft animals to, horses and cows and goats and sheep, especially to carry away or this debris or to help make your canals? And what does social organization look like when you don't have a king or a chief or somebody in charge trying to tell everybody what to do? How do you organize society? And obviously they did because they're making these miles of canals and maintaining them. How do you do that in a society without overt hierarchy? So it offers these really interesting like counter models, which I think kind of undermine or challenge some of the dominant ways we think about hierarchy and society. So like the Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan Hohokam makes pottery, but instead of a black on white, we have this kind of red on buff pottery, and also traded widely throughout the Southwest. We also see evidence of Hohokam art through kind of stone work and petroglyphs. Um, and by about 1200, we see this shift, right? During the Classic, most of these are pit houses and adobe wall, these almost family compounds. But after about 1200, we start to see kind of bigger platforms, probably pointing to kind of elite residences and some kind of hierarchy or social grades kind of emerging based on the architecture. But like we see in the ancestral Puebloan region, there after a while things start to fall apart. After about 1400, 1450, there's this massive collapse of Hohokam civilization, which is again kind of not quite the Spanish era. So it's not due to colonialism or disease or anything like that, which we would expect in kind of later social collapse. It's often thought of as kind of environmental collapse, like the weather changes, or especially the desert gets drier and hotter, making it harder to support these larger congregations of people doing agriculture. Sometimes we see the dispersal of these Hohokam groups to cliff dwellings, like we see with the Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan, like this one in Tonto Basin, probably fortified, right? It's much harder to sneak up on somebody if you're back to the cave like that, and there's only one kind of entrance that you have to go up, and it's fortified with walls and stuff like that. And other times we see people kind of disperse into smaller groups. This is very similar to the Maya pattern, right? When the ancient cities collapsed in the lowlands of Maya regions, people didn't disappear. They went back to being small scale farmers, right? You don't need those elites. You don't need the city. You can get by on your own. And this is what we see even today. The group, the Tohono O'odham, or often known as the Pima native group, which lives right on the border of present day, Arizona and Mexico, are likely the descendants of Hohokam people who kind of move into these dispersed patterns out into the desert in order to, when your big civilization can't make it because of environmental problems, you often see people disperse into smaller groups. And today you can actually, if you go to Arizona, you can go visit the reservations of Tohono O'odham and see these kind of descendant communities there. Well, that's all the time that we have. We won't get to Mogollon today, but you can check it out in the book, kind of the forested region of Southwest New Mexico. But in general, when we think of the Southwest, just kind of and wrap up, we see similar patterns, right? Starting out these kind of semi-subterranean pit houses during the early agricultural time, congregating into larger groups of these pueblo, or towns in the early AD to like 1000 AD, and then kind of in the late prehistoric era from about 1100 to about 1400. Seems like there's some kind of collapse of civilization, probably related to environmental change or desertification or an arid cycle, in which people don't disappear, but they spread out into these different places, often more dispersed, often more fortified, with evidence of conflict and warfare. So that's kind of the stage that we're going to set. Next time, we're going to look at what happens when new people show up in the Southwest. First with the Dene people, the Navajo and Apache people, rolling about 1400, and then the Spanish 100 or 150 years later. So how does that change kind of the dynamic of what's going on in the Southwest? Are there any questions? Cool. So we'll be doing this from here on out, doing our grand tour of native North America. Thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you all on Friday.